The Banker's July 2020 edition will mark the 50th anniversary of the magazine's annual Top 1000 World Banks ranking. To celebrate this milestone, we'll be talking with thought leaders from regional banking markets to understand how the sector has changed over this time. I'm James King, the Banker's Europe editor, and I'm joined today by Tiina Lee, Deutsche Bank's chief executive for the UK and Ireland. Tiina, thanks for being here today.
Thank you. Thanks, James.
So really looking at the European banking sector over this time frame, it's an interesting story because we've seen, obviously, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, that story of European integration really unfold. And I'm thinking here about the launch of the single markets, the launch of the currency union, and so on, sort of coinciding with deeper political integration as well. Given some of those sort of headline trends over that period, what did the regional banking sort of landscape look like at the turn of the millennium in the early 2000s?
So the overarching recollection that I have is really that of mass fragmentation. I mean, clearly that's always been the case in countries such as Germany, which has long had a banking system based upon the private commercial banks such as Deutsche Bank, the savings and the Landesbanks, and the cooperative banks. And in spite of the reforms in European markets that you alluded to, I still do think of the world in terms of the pre and post financial crisis and how we've gone from a landscape in Germany with, I think, just under 3,000 banks to around 1,800 today. So in this period, I had run Deutsche Bank's medium-term note trading business and subsequently the financial institutions group. So I was very well placed to see how the creation of the euro and the implementation of passporting across European borders led to an explosion of business, with regional players becoming increasingly active, not only as issuers of euro-denominated debt, but also as buyers of international assets denominated in the new currency.
So really then we saw, obviously, in that first decade of the millennium, sort of, as you mentioned, an explosion of activity, strong business growth, and then you mentioned, obviously, this sort of watershed moment of the financial crisis and the way that shaped the European sort of banking landscape. How did that restructure, I guess, the playing field? What does it look like afterwards?
So, I mean, I think the financial crisis remains a watershed moment for us all, even today. And believe it or not, I still think we're still seeing things play out here in Europe. So in the aftermath of the financial crisis, we did see some significant consolidation on a national level. So a really good example is in Spain, where there were about 45 Spanish savings banks in 2007, the Cajas. Now, today, there's only about 2 in their original form. Or, of course, here in the UK, where we saw the collapse of many UK mortgage lenders, such as HBOS and Northern Rock. But more broadly, we saw many large institutions begin to adjust their business models away from trading and cross-border activities and more towards other areas of their strength, such as wealth management, asset management, or corporate banking. But I mean, I should say, just as an overarching comment, that the profitability of the European banking sector does continue to be challenged by the negative interest rate environment that has persisted since 2014. And sadly, there's little chance of change due to the ongoing COVID-19 situation.
Sure. Okay. So profitability is under pressure, and obviously forces are working against European banks at the moment. And one of the other sort of overarching themes, I guess, linked to sort of the outcome of the financial crisis was this, changing kind of regulatory landscape, both at a regional level and at a global level. Do you think that drive has sort of changed sort of the culture of banking in Europe, and to what extent has that sort of played out, do you think?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I mean, I think that, it's really well documented how fast the Americans were post 2008 in recapitalizing their banking sector. But I think it's easy to forget that a lot has been accomplished in Europe with the creation of the single resolution mechanism and the single supervisory mechanism. So yes, there has been a heightened regulatory agenda. I like to think that we have hit peak regulation, but I would say, looking back, that it was mostly warranted. So today, banks have at least 4 times more equity than they did in 2007, are more resilient, stronger balance sheets. And it means that as this global pandemic has hit, the banking sector has been able to be part of the solution and not the problem. I would say, with regard to your question around the culture of banking, that one area that has clearly matured since the financial crisis that addresses that directly has been that of the wholesale conduct agenda. So it's been very much driven by the Financial Conduct Authority here in the UK, but it's also been incredibly well absorbed by national regulators across Europe. And it's become a key priority for many business leaders, including myself.
And you mentioned there, just in terms of the outcomes of this regulatory drive, some of the strengths of the sector. So I guess in terms of the current crisis we're seeing today, that European banks are in a very different place from where they were a decade ago during the last crisis. They're much stronger than they were.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, clearly we're going to see an uptick, and we've begun to see that already in terms of credit loss provisions, but it's from a completely different base to what we were seeing in 2008, 2009.
Okay, sure. And I guess the other key sort of long-term driver of sort of banking development really lies in the domain of technology and innovation, which is obviously shaping the sector globally. But I think Europe has got some very interesting dimensions to it as well. In what ways do you see kind of the nexus between technology and banking sort of shaping the future of the industry in the region? And I guess, how is that playing out in terms of the need for banks to maintain strong customer relationships while also deploying technology at the same time?
So, I mean, I think it's a great question because, I mean, clearly digitalization has been a hot topic for a number of years, but I've always really been a believer that technology will continue to embed itself in the banking industry rather than just purely disrupt it. So, and you sort of alluded to it, Jane. For me, it's all about enhancing the customer experience. If we do that well, it binds our clients closer to us. So a really good example for Deutsche has been Autobahn. So this was a product that we had launched way back in 1996 as one of the first electronic trading platforms. And we've continued to invest in it over the years, adding more functionality. And it's really come into its own in the past few months. With the extreme market volatility we saw in March, it resulted in many clients being unable to execute on multi-dealer platforms, but they were able to execute on Autobahn. Right. I think on a slightly more prosaic level, the other observation that I would make is really around the digital pace of change we have witnessed through this global pandemic. So, for example, through sheer necessity, we, for example, have seen a big uptick in demand from our clients for our digital signature room. So that allows the digital versions of contractual documents and signatures. So this was functionality we'd already developed that has really come into its own in recent times that arguably would have taken years for our clients to get comfortable with in peacetime. So I think digitalization isn't just a gradual thing. I think we've actually moved really fast. And as we slowly return to our offices over the coming months, I don't believe we're going to go back to our old ways of doing things.
Okay, well, Tiina, it's very interesting to hear, and we'll see how that plays out. But in the meantime, thank you for your time today. Thanks very much.
It's a pleasure. Thanks a lot.